complete chaos, my constituents are bracing themselves for big tax.
Hello there, and thank you for joining us once again for another Ukraine War Q&A. But this week we're going to expand it a little bit more because there's a lot more going on geopolitically than just the war in Ukraine, important as that conflict remains. I've got Professor Michael Clarke here with us, as always. Professor Clarke, thanks very much for being with us. I'm glad you got the memo about wearing grey suits.
Yes, exactly.
I didn't put my tie on, though, unfortunately. I took it off earlier. And thank you guys for submitting all of your questions. As always, you can submit questions as we're going along, either in the YouTube channel or in the blog, the live blog that is on our website. So why don't we just get straight into it? Professor Clarke, we're going to start with a question on Gaza. And so this is more than just about the war in Ukraine right now. This is a question from Brenda, who says, I saw Professor Clarke predicted there might be a Gaza ceasefire before Trump's claim of a 60-day deal last night. Looking very prescient. Does he think there's a real chance of peace, and what happens next?
In Gaza? Well, it would depend on the terms of whatever peace is agreed, because there's an awful lot of details to sort out, such as, would Israeli forces really withdraw? How many would they leave behind? How many hostages would be released? Would all of them be released? What's going to happen to the humanitarian aid, which is in a terrible mess at the moment? And 60 days is useful, but it doesn't solve the basic problem that Hamas is still there. They may not be militarily effective, but they are effective inside Gaza. The Gazan people are still very frightened of them, and they still control Gaza. So there is a possibility of a pause in Gaza. It would be the third ceasefire, if there is one, arising next week. And, any ceasefire opens up other hopes of a different sort of dialogue. So we could hope for that. I mean, I suspect that there might be some elements of a ceasefire. I mean, certainly, President Trump is going to work very hard on Netanyahu when he gets him next week.
Seeing him on Monday,
On Monday in D.C. And, we understand that the Qataris and the Egyptians, but the Qataris in particular, are working very hard on Hamas. They're the link into Hamas. Hamas have had these sort of proposals before, and they've always turned them down. But this time they might feel that they have to go along with them, partly because of what's happened to Iran. I mean, Hamas's backer in Tehran is it's sixes and sevens, and effectively Hamas is now on its own. It really doesn't have an effective backer in that respect. So it may be that Hamas will think a little bit differently.
Not to try and get into the minds of a terror group like Hamas, but their argument has always been, hasn't it, that the Israelis have to withdraw entirely.
Yeah, they've always said.
I wonder now if, as you say, with Iran having been defeated, having no backers, that Hamas are going to have to take a deal that doesn't have that a provision of the Israelis pulling out all the way.
Because the Israelis have always said, we will not give up the Philadelphia corridor, which is the border between Gaza and Egypt. And they probably would keep troops in the Netzarim corridor further north, because that gives them control of the north. And also, the Israelis are really hitting Gaza this week. Terrific number of casualties, pushing people down into the south and the southwest of the Strip. So it's a terrible situation. But it may well be that Hamas would have to agree to some Israeli presence in Gaza in order just to get a 60-day pause, which I'm pretty sure Hamas need as badly as everybody else.
Yeah, and to get those at least 50 hostages out as well. All right, let's move on to Ukraine. Question here from Anonymous. Interesting name. What's happening with North Korea sending more troops? Will there be a summer offensive? There was a bit of a spring offensive. There's been some movement, not much on the line, but is there going to be a summer one now?
Well, there is one. Yeah, it has started. A spring offensive drifted into a summer offensive where the Russians are bringing forward a lot of troops all at once. But they now look as if they're trying to threaten different areas. So apart from the areas in the Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk, which they've been fighting for so hard, they now look as if they're trying to threaten Sumy and Kharkiv in the north, 2 other oblasts. And they look as if they intend to get into Dnipropetrovsk, which is next door to Donetsk. It's further west. And the Russians are claiming that they have taken Dazhny, which, if they have, is on the Dnipropetrovsk side of the border. So the Russians are trying to extend their offensive, if only to distract the Ukrainians, to actually give them more territory to worry about, more areas of the border that they've got to cover. Whether they can really make a significant inroads into any of those areas is doubtful, because the Russians are at full stretch at the moment and they're not being very successful. They're being very, very slowly successful, even though they've taken more territory in the last month than they have for the last 2 or 3 months. But nevertheless, it's very slow progress at very high cost. They're still losing over 1,000 a day, 1,200, 1,300 a day, according to our own British intelligence estimates. So that will go on. North Koreans is a different issue. The North Koreans, in a sense, were legally entitled to fight in Kursk because that's Russian territory, and they were helping their brother Russians repel an invasion into Kursk. If the North Koreans turn up anywhere else, if they were to turn up in Luhansk or Donetsk or anywhere else on the front line, then legally they're inside Ukraine, and that would count as a North Korean invasion of another sovereign country. Now, would they be prepared to do it? Yes, probably. The North Koreans they took big losses. I mean, they had about 11 to 12,000 troops. They look as if they lost 4,000 of them, killed and injured. Kim Jong-un was seen this week with tears in his eyes, literally crying at an event to commemorate the North Korean dead who were being repatriated back to Pyongyang. But I'm not sure if they have enough. Would they put enough in to make a difference? If they put enough in to invade Ukraine, to cooperate with the invasion of Ukraine, they'd need to put in 20 to 30,000 to make a difference. Would they do that? Probably not. But we'll see.
We'll see. And as you say, they'll be in Ukrainian territory proper.
Yeah.
But of course, if they go into Luhansk or Donetsk or Kherson or Zaporizhia, those are the annexed oblasts.
Exactly. And the Russians will claim, well, this is Russian territory, but the international world doesn't recognise that. So I think there'll be more sanctions on North Korea as a result. It'll be even more of a pariah state, and there'll be every reason then for the South Koreans to take some action to try to mitigate the effects or to punish North Korea in some way. So, I mean, what the South Koreans would do, we don't quite know, but it would certainly make the situation in East Asia even more tense if the North Koreans were seen now to invade another country just for the sake of a friend of theirs in Moscow.
There's one to definitely keep an eye on, as there could be an expansion.
Yes.
And speaking then of those oblasts that have been annexed by the Russians, announced this week by Russia. I don't think it's been confirmed by Ukraine yet that Luhansk has been taken entirely by
the Russians are claiming it. It's probably true because they were pushing in Kupiansk, which the Ukrainians had taken back in the autumn of 2022. And the Russians are now pretty well back in control of Kupiansk, as I understand it. So it's probably true that the Russians have got the whole of Luhansk. If not, it's only little bits that they don't now control. They probably do. They don't have the whole of Donetsk, although they've got a lot of it. They've got probably 3/4 of it now. And they probably will get it, but they still have to take Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. These are the two places we've been talking about month after month after month. Kramatorsk is the most important. And the Russians have still got some way to go, and it will cost them a lot more troops, more thousands of troops, to take Kramatorsk. But that's undoubtedly what they will try to do before the winter. And the winter, we can be fairly certain, is in effect the last 2 weeks of October. That the weather is very predictable in Ukraine, so it gets wet toward the end of October.
Stop them moving. If they're not moving very far, it will slow them down. I mean, what's the importance of them having taken all of Luhansk, if it is proven to be right? That will give them control of one of the oblasts that make up the Donbass, the one being Donetsk. But
and it would give them control of the only oblast that the 4 oblasts that they've annexed since 2014. They annexed Crimea. That's the 5th one. But the 4 that have been in contention since the invasion of 2022, that would mean that they've now taken one completely taken one of the 4 oblasts that they claim to have annexed back to Russia.
Will Ukraine attempt to try and take it back, or this is part of the maximalist demand, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is going to be Russian territory now. They would hope those 4.
For sure, the Ukrainians will take it back if they can. I mean, again, if they can get back over the Oskil River, get back to the eastern side of the Oskil River, which is that was their great offensive in 2022. They managed to cross the river. They took the Russians by surprise. If they could repeat that feat at some time in the future and move back into north of Luhansk, I mean, if you remember, Kramatorsk. Sorry, not Kramatorsk, Crimea was really important, and the Russians looked as if they were just desperately holding on at Crimea, and they did hold on, and then they moved out. I mean, if the Ukrainians could get back to threatening Crimea, because if you get hold of Crimea, then the Russians have got to go 60 kilometres further east before they can dig in again, in effect, if you look at the landscape there. So the Ukrainians won't give up their aspirations to get Luhansk back. For sure.
We had a question come in. Sorry, that was a question from Glenn on Luhansk, by the way. Thank you for that, Glenn. We had a question come in from Alexander, who wishes us a good afternoon. Thank you for this one. Alexander's watching along. He said he was born in London, but he's half Estonian, and he travels to Tallinn often to see family. How likely do you think there will be an invasion of Estonia if Russia were successful in Ukraine? I guess successful is doing a lot of the lifting in that sentence. I don't know what that would look like, certainly for Russians, but the threat to Estonia.
Threat to Estonia is very real, not necessarily of an invasion of the sort that the Russians launched in Ukraine in 2022, but of destabilization of the sort that the Russians launched in the Donbass in 2014. So the little green men, and other Spetsnaz forces who look like civilians, look like young soccer hooligans, and they behave then like trained military professionals. And the chances of a crisis in Estonia are quite high, because take the city of Narva. There's the river, and one side of the river is the Russian fortress, the old medieval fortress, and on the other side of the river is the Estonian fortress, and they look at each other across the river, across the bridge. And Narva is effectively it's a Russian city in terms of the people who live there and the language and the style, and people in Narva reportedly, and our friend will probably know, feel very conflicted. Why wouldn't they? Of course they do. And so the possibility of destabilization in Estonia is quite high, higher in Estonia than in Latvia, further south, or Lithuania, further south again. Estonia is probably the most vulnerable of the 3 Baltic states for this reason, because of a quite a big Russian minority, Russian-speaking minority, many of whom, of course, were the old Red Army retirees. When people retired from the Red Army, they went to live with their families in the Baltic states because life was just better there.
Yeah, right.
It was more Scandinavian. And so they all retired to the Baltics, and have had families and have created that sense of Russianness in the Baltics. Not in Lithuania, but in Estonia and Latvia. And what the Russians will be trying to do in Estonia, if we anticipate this, and NATO thinks about this a lot, is create some sort of destabilization to create a militarized crisis in Estonia that isn't actually an invasion, but is a militarized crisis. And NATO doesn't respond, or doesn't respond strongly enough.
Because, of course, Estonia is a NATO.
It's a NATO member, and Article 5, the famous Article 5, should apply.
Should apply.
And then it would be clear to the rest of NATO, to the other 31 countries of NATO, that Article 5 is all a bit flexy. It's not really very reliable. The Americans certainly won't come to your aid. Just because you've got a crisis in Estonia. And by putting a conceptual hole in Article 5, that lesson would not then be lost on Hungary and Bulgaria and Slovakia and on the southern NATO members, who would therefore say, look, we can see the way the wind is blowing, we better get used to the idea of Russian power and domination in our part of the world. And so that's the threat to Estonia. Not so much an invasion, but a crisis which actually punctures the glass of Article 5, sort of in emergency break glass. Well, that would break the glass, but not actually puncture the alarm, not actually set the alarm off.
It'll be a test, wouldn't it? And I'm going to do something a bit unorthodox here. I'm going to give a shout out to a podcast on the Telegraph called Ukraine the Latest, which is excellent. I can recommend you listening to it, who've actually, in the past couple of days, talked about a story out of Estonia. It's written up in the newspaper here, just in the past week from the 21st of June. I can recommend you reading it, about Russia Russia using nuns to spread propaganda in Estonia. The Estonian government warning that there's a convent up in eastern Estonia whose nuns are actually spreading pro-Russian propaganda, and there is this fear, of course, that this could be the beginning of, as you say, this sort of hybrid warfare where you create some kind of crisis. The little green men go marching in.
The Russians always used to say, I mean, before 2014, they used to say that Estonia was the locus of a lot of criminality, gang crime and drug running and so on. And a lot of it was not true. A little bit of it was true, but most of it wasn't. But they targeted Estonia for a disinformation campaign. Right. And I even had my name used as part of that.
My goodness, really? In what way?
A Spetsnaz officer who I used to know. I mean, he was, he didn't know know I knew he was Spetsnaz, but I did. And he worked with me for a little while when things were supposed to be all friendly between us. And then he went back to Russia. And he quoted me as an authority on these criminals operating in Estonia.
Oh, my goodness.
And I was called up by some of our security people. Said, "Did you say this?" I said, "No, of course I didn't."
Wow.
And he said, "Did you write this?" "No, I didn't write this." And he was inventing things in my name as evidence from an eminent Western observer, which proved what was going on in Estonia. It was all completely false.
Because Estonia is seen as what, a weak link in the fence.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. And so that was the attempt to create a sense that Estonia was the basis of criminal conspiracies that were dangerous to everybody, Russians as well as Europeans, was an old established thing. And I'm talking now about the early 2000s.
Really interesting stuff.
Late 90s, early 2000s, yeah. Spetsnaz were very active in Estonia in those years.
Right. Well, that's something I guess we will come back to on here and keep a close eye on. Thanks very much for that question, Alexander. Question here from RZ. Who says recently Russians took the Shevchenko lithium field. How important is that to Ukraine? Yeah,
Shevchenko it's a settlement. It's about 5-8 kilometers south of Pokrovsk, and the Russians have not taken Pokrovsk, even though they've tried for a long time, and now they're trying to encircle it, and they're having more success with that. And so they've got round to the south, and Shevchenko is one of the settlements to the southwest of Pokrovsk. It's one of, I think, 4 lithium fields. It's regarded, I think, as probably the best of the 4, but none of them have been exploited yet. It's just that they're known to be there, and the Shevchenko one is thought probably to be the most profitable. The other one is on the Sea of Azov, right on the coast, which is in the Russian zone. And the other 2 are far to the west. So they're well away from the war, the other 2 fields. So it's a talking point. And of course, if the minerals deal with the United States,
what does it mean to Trump's deal?
It ought not to be lost on Washington that if they just let the Russians walk all over Ukraine, their minerals deal will be worthless anyway. I mean, I've never been impressed by this minerals deal. No. The practicalities of it always seem to me to be foolish. I don't think it'll ever produce anything worthwhile either for the Americans or the Ukrainians. Not for the next.
Wasn't the promise that if the Americans could have access to it, then they would keep supplying Kyiv? Wasn't that sort of the tacit?
That was
right?
the idea, yeah.
Right.
But nothing's happened.
No.
And if these rare earth fields keep getting overrun by the Russians, then who's going to invest in mining these?
That's the point.
Earths?
It's not even like these are functioning institutions. You'd have to go. You have to do the mining to get them.
And nobody's
anyway.
going to get close to a war zone, even if you're a long way away. I mean, they could still be bombed. So I don't think that the minerals deal is I've always thought was a piece of theatre. But so is it important? Not really, because again we can talk about rare earths. I mean, there's nothing particularly rare about rare earths. There's lots of them. It's a question of finding out where they are, and it's not as if Ukraine's got more of them than anywhere else. It just hasn't. It's got what you'd expect it to have. The issue about rare earths is that more than 90% of them are processed by China. So mining them is one thing. Getting access to them is via China. And the Americans are finding now, the Chinese just this week add 7 more elements to their export controls, that the Americans thought that they could coerce China over tariffs. And the Chinese have discovered they can coerce America over rare earths much more effectively, over export controls over rare earths. And the Americans are really feeling the pinch now. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, is having to reassure Congress that they will be able to import enough magnets from China with rare earth elements. But he doesn't know. He's just hoping that the Chinese will relent on it.
We'll see, won't we? And I wondered how that sentence was going to end when you described the rarity as theatre. Probably a less polite way of describing that idea from the Trump administration.
Other adjectives are available.
Right. Okay, let's move on to a question here from Alan W. He asks, how significant is it that Putin announced he's reducing military spending next year? I've just pulled up the article. It's from a few days ago, where he says that he's going to cut military expenditure from next year in a contrast to NATO's plan to increase spending. I mean, can we believe what's been said by him?
No, not really. I mean, what he's reacting to is the fact that the economy is turning down a little bit. Elvira Nabiullina, who is the chair of the central bank in Russia, and other people who are genuinely respected, both in Russia and in the wider finance world, are saying that Russia's now on the verge of recession. I mean, they had a 4% growth rate, stimulated by all the war economy. That's what happens when you put war production, you ramp it up, so growth rate goes up. But of course, it's a temporary blip. And Russia's growth this year, I mean, last year, 2024, was 4.4%. This year, it's 1.4%.
Right.
It's almost collapsed. And the Russians now admit that they're on the verge of going into recession, which is zero growth for more than 3 quarters. That's what they're looking at now. And Putin has admitted, even with all of his expansive rhetoric about the use of force and the rights of the Russian Empire and so on, he's admitted that their economy is suffering some issues. They've got their interest rate is over 10%. The official, the inflation is over 10%. It's more like 12%. Their interest rates have gone to 21%. And there's just no available cash for businesses. So all the available cash and liquidity has gone into war production.
Right.
And so the rest of the economy is just sort of bumping along. Nobody can get money to develop their businesses, which is what they need to do, because all of the available credit has been directed by the government through the banks into war production. And for that reason, the Russians are now talking about having to retrench a little bit. And that's the polite way of saying that they're going to have a very bumpy 2025, which is why, if this war goes on, the pendulum will probably start to swing against them, at least economically, by the autumn of this year. If they're into recession now, if they're about to go into a second quarter recession, then a third and a fourth quarter recession, by the time we get to the fourth quarter, and then the first quarter of 2026, their economy will be in some trouble.
But Michael, what does that look like? Because the sanctions went in hard on Russia as soon as they invaded Ukraine. We were told that their economy would collapse then, and as we've seen, it hasn't collapsed. People in Moscow, St. Petersburg are living their lives as normal in many ways. So, and there are other countries that have lived with deficits. It doesn't. The country
they still carry on. Yeah,
they still
big
carry
countries
on.
can carry on. Yeah,
big countries can do it, can't they?
It's a very fair point. And I never said that the economy will collapse. A lot of people did, or some people did, and it was never the case. I mean, the Russian economy is a big economy, and big economies can stagger on. And still function, which is what they were doing. And so, the sanctions did affect them and do affect them, but they've learned how to get around lots of them. And we in the West have not been good enough at chasing sanctions. I mean, once you impose sanctions, you then got to chase them.
You've got to make sure
because whoever the sanctions are against will find ways around them. They'll find mechanisms to undermine them and undercut them. And you've got to keep chasing. And we haven't chased nearly hard enough, and we know that, and we just haven't done it because we're trying not to inconvenience ourselves too much. So it is the case that the Russian economy can continue. It's not that they're going to have to stop the war because the economy is coming into a crisis. That won't be the case. But it will get harder for them to maintain their levels of production, and it will get harder for them to, as it were, keep the population happy, because the deal that Putin has always implicitly done with his people since he came to power in 1999 is forget about your human rights, forget about all this stuff. You'll just be more prosperous under me. Yeah. Russia will develop. And recently, last 5 to 8 years, I will make Russia a great power again. So you'll be better off, and you'll sit in a power that the world takes seriously again after humiliating us for 20 odd years. And forget about freedoms, forget about all that. You don't need that. Just live, just take my view. And so that's kind of the social contract. And if the economy starts to really stutter, then the most central part of that social contract that he has established implicitly with the Russian people will become very thin indeed. And that will worry him.
Yes, and remains to be seen how that happens. As you say, big countries can struggle on when their economy is in the toilet, as it were. I lived in Turkey for a long time, and their economic outlook was terrible, but yet the country continued on and continues on to this day in many ways, with a leader that's still
economy is
very much in power.
On, but with greater inequality, more misery for the disadvantaged.
But then repression cracks down, right, then
That's
you have
right.
you have greater repression. I mean, if Russian people could opposition be greater, more highly repressed, it'd be hard to see. But
Just one final point on that, Kamali, is that the essence is not that the people get so fed up with Putin that they get rid of him. It isn't that. It is that people get very fed up, and the oligarchs move against him because they
Those
see
that have been
their
making money
prospect
all this time.
Yeah, because the social contract that really matters. It's the same as the social contract with the majority of the population, but it's the one that he has with the oligarchs, which is the same terms. Just forget about the political freedom stuff. I will make you rich, and I will make you part of a great power. And if that starts to get thin with them, then they will start to turn against him. And then public discontent then finds a way of mobilising if they go first.
Yeah, and she said that he's the very tip of all of that, isn't he? All right, going to move on to a few quick fire questions. Michael, I know you love this round. This is one from Tina, and the question is, can Russia capture Sumy?
Capture?
Sumy.
No. It can get ground, but they've not taken a city since Mariupol. They took Kherson because it was offered to them in effect. I mean, Russian troops moved into Kherson in 2022. They took Mariupol after 2-3 months of dreadful struggle. They haven't taken the city since. And
they were kicked out of the city. Were they kicked out of Kharkiv as well? They were kicked out of Kharkiv as well.
Kharkiv, yeah, exactly. Well, kicked out of Kharkiv Oblast. And they kicked out of Kherson, the city. So yeah, they were kicked out of one of the two cities they did have. So they haven't taken the city. Unless Sumy is somehow surrendered to them. And Sumy is very close to the border, so it's not impossible. But can they take it? I don't think they can. Kharkiv even less so. Kharkiv is the second city; it's a big city.
Yep.
He couldn't even surround it properly in 2022. So I think the answer to that is no, unless they really concentrate their forces and bring forces from elsewhere to attack one city exclusively. And I don't see any sign that they're doing that.
And an addendum to that, just on the 30th, Kyiv Independent reporting that Ukrainian forces say they've stabilized the situation in Sumy Oblast and pushed the Russian army further away from the capital, Sumy. Of course, that's the
geographically, Sumy is the most vulnerable of the big cities because it's the one that's closest to the border.
But it seems the Ukrainians have pushed back a little bit. All right, question here from Dennis. Can NATO really expect to fight off Russia as it is today?
Dennis, it would depend entirely on the scenario. Fight where, when, over what. If it was a war, I often say a staff college exercise. Imagine you're at Sandhurst as a young officer, and you're given, the map of Europe, and say, okay, right, just for fun.
When you do the Estonia example, then when you take us back,
something like that. NATO now could fight Russia pretty effectively. I mean, NATO with America would wipe the floor with Russia. NATO without America would still be pretty effective in a limited conflict, but in an all-out conflict. If Russia was fully mobilised, then the answer would be pretty problematical because NATO is not fully mobilised.
Yes.
But a European NATO in 3 to 5 years' time will be a different proposition and will be pretty safe from, if you like, a Russian victory in some sort of all-out war. Doesn't mean to say that it would succeed in a more limited confrontation. It would all it's so context specific. It would depend what it was about, what the stakes were, what the commitment to it was, and so on.
Okay, let's move on to a question then from H. Talks about Ukraine's successful use of low-cost drones on those targets. It's talking about Operation Spiderweb. Of course, what are the implications for NATO's Ukraine's use of drones? I think I've seen recently as well, Ukraine has started to use ground-based drones as well.
Yes,
they're now starting to come onto the battlefront. It's
very much so. I mean, robotics. I mean, when we say drones, it's really everyone thinks of drones as the things that are flying around, but it's part of the robotics revolution, which is the use of robots. So robot vehicles, robot ships, robot aircraft, robot drones, and the implications are huge. Because it's not that drones are revolutionary, but the use of them in high numbers with sort of AI targeting or AI intelligence so that drones operate intelligently together in high numbers. That's added a new dimension to the battlefield. And as I've said many times, I guess, that air power is still very fundamental to attack and defence in warfare. But up to 5,000 feet or below 5,000 feet is now the drone war. That's the drone area, and that's the battle between the drones. I mean, aircraft still operate below that area, but in a way, the bottom 5,000 feet of airspace. If you think of airspace effectively going from about 40,000 feet down to zero, the bottom 5,000 feet is for the drones.
Or drone warfare.
And they fight, and there's an arms race going on between drones, drone technologies that we've spoken about before, and that will get more intensive. And yes, Western countries are trying to learn a lot from this. And in Britain, we're switching a lot of resources now into robotics, not drones always, but robotics in general. That's sixth generation. In the jargon, fifth generation is like the F-35, is the fifth generation aircraft. Sixth generation is the Tempest aircraft, which would be one aircraft and half a dozen wingmen, all of whom are robots.
Wow.
So imagine one pilot in one aircraft with six robots flying around him or her as a sort of little air group all on their own, to put it simply.
Incredible stuff. People are trying to manufacture these drones in great numbers, of course. I think they're almost on about 300 a day in Ukraine and in Russia. And they were just recently signed with the Netherlands a contract to produce some 600,000 drones that would be sent to Ukraine.
I mean, Ukraine are working now to produce multiple millions of drones a year of all types, since they're cheap to produce, and you just got to keep turning them out.
Yeah.
And the issue is not so much the production, although I don't mean to make that sound simple, but it isn't so much the numbers you produce, it's the ability to deploy them in intelligent ways.
Yeah.
So there's not just one person on the end of every drone, because then you're not saving any manpower by doing that. You've got to be able to control several drones with one person saying, right, I control this 2 square kilometers of ground, and my 500 drones are going to do this, this, and this within that area. And I control it through my system and my AI tools. That's where we are with it.
Incredible evolution of warfare, isn't it? All right, we're going to move on to a question here from Silver Fox. It's about the War Game podcast, which I can recommend everyone listening to. It is excellent, scary, but excellent.
Yeah, it was.
And Silver Fox says they've listened to the podcast. Thank you for that. And in the event of a Russian attack on this country, which is the hypothetical scenario in War Game, who do you think we could realistically rely on as an ally?
Again, it would depend on the context. It's very hard to imagine a scenario in which Russia would attack Britain alone, or even, threaten to attack Britain alone. It's not absolutely impossible to imagine. You could think of it as the podcast did. You could think of it as a sort of a scenario for a novel, I suppose. But it's very hard in political analysis to think of that. So our allies would depend on who else felt threatened in the same sort of way. But I know what lies behind this is, can we rely on the United States?
Absolutely.
And the answer is probably not. In a scenario in which US interests were as enmeshed as ours being, the North Europeans or most of Europe, then, we can rely on the United States. But if Britain and Russia got into some sort of militarized crisis, say over shipping in the North Sea or cutting our cables, cutting our pipelines, only our pipelines. If that was the problem, which I know was a feature of the podcast, would the Americans help? Well, they would help, but would they commit to us in terms of Article 5? Not at the moment, for sure.
Interesting.
Not at the moment.
Interesting. And again, sorry to bring you the breaking news on this. With all that's going on in the politics here, it's been underreported this, but Germany and the UK have announced they're going to sign a mutual defence pact. That's being reported by Politico and Reuters on the 17th of July. The mutual defence treaty, which includes assistance clause in the event of a threat to any other. I mean, is that what we're going to start seeing, do you think? Bilateral treaties?
Exactly right, yeah. I mean, the Labour government's been working on that from day one. We've got an arrangement with France, which goes back to the Lancaster House treaties and so on. It's all been a bit empty, but it's more real now because our interests are more closely aligned. And whenever we have an issue, to deal with France, we get on very well. When we collaborate on something, it turns out we do very well. But we don't actually have that much to collaborate on most of the time. That's changing. And the idea was that we need to develop a much more structured relationship with Germany, whom we have, very historically really good relations with. And because German defence is now becoming serious again, it's been a joke for 30-odd years, quite literally. I mean, a joke in terms of Germany's capabilities.
And they're training with like broomsticks and stuff.
Yeah, all of that. Forces that were sent to Afghanistan that were not allowed to fight at night by Parliament and forbidden them to fight at night. I mean, it just was risible. But that's changing. And, I mean, ultimately, the powerful states in Europe, in Northern Europe, is Germany and Poland and the Scandinavian states. And Britain, our role is a strategic reserve, not necessarily to be on the front line on day one, because we just don't have the numbers. But Germany will have the numbers. I mean, they're creating a force of, it's going to be, 300 to 400,000 more active. Poland is going from 250,000 to 500,000. Those will be the big forces. And the British force will be a sort of strategic reserve that will move in particular areas to do the things that we're good at, and the Navy will provide the same sort of capabilities, strategic reserve in the North Atlantic, and that needs to be structured a bit more. So this is all part of this, what I've called, you and I have discussed before, this coming together of the North European members.
Yeah.
Northern NATO is, within the NATO treaty, but separately, is now beginning to develop a much more common view, partly because we can't just leave it to the United States, and we can't rely on the United States.
It doesn't except there's all these sort of overlapping things. Whenever we talk about this, I always think about JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which doesn't include Germany or Poland yet, but it's this...
That's right. If Germany and Poland came into the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, and I think they might at some point, then it would look really pretty powerful.
Yeah.
It would look very good.
A big old NATO inside NATO.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
All right, let's move on to another question here from Stuart. It's about the War Game podcast, and again, sorry, spoiler, an attack on Fastlane, the submarine base up in Scotland. I mean, would that be a target in the event that we found ourselves at war? Yeah.
However, I mean, in the event of a militarised crisis, I mean, everything will have left. I mean, that's the whole point.
They'll have got out, won't they?
I mean, in the event of a crisis, I mean, one thing that ships do is put to sea. Right. And if they don't, it's their own fault, in a sense, for getting caught there. But yeah, would we lose the base? Almost certainly. Almost certainly.
Okay. Move on. Mojo Pin. When will the UK be able to fight a war with Russia? I mean, would we want to do it on our own and be able to win it?
Again, Staff College exercise. Britain would never win a war against Russia.
Just overmatched,
ever,
right? Yeah.
Ever. Yes, we'd be overmatched for numbers. And, if we fought a war anytime soon, we'd be out of ammunition within 2 weeks anyway. I mean, we have no chance. Britain-Russia war of the sort, like the Crimea War of 1855.
A couple hundred years to...
Yeah, forget it. But that's not the realistic scenario. The scenario is, collectively, do we take a leading role in a group of nations who are prepared to stand up to Russia if we feel the need to? And the answer is, can we do that? Yes, we can. Are we militarily capable? Not really at the moment, but will we be? Probably. I mean, how long? 3 to 5 years.
We wouldn't have to stand alone in that.
Yeah, I can't imagine a scenario where Britain will be standing alone against Russia, except in the matter of maybe cyber attack.
Yeah, okay.
Political attack, social media attack. I mean, we're in the crosshairs of Russia now. I mean, the Russians really want to attack us in these sub-threshold ways, and that goes on day after day. So we're already in that sort of war with Russia. But a traditional war,
shooting war,
a one-to-one traditional war, British troops against Russian troops only, I can't imagine how it would work out.
Okay. Question here from Crouchy, number 8. Why would the UK be buying those F-35As, reliant on the US for its weapons, when America is proving itself unreliable?
Yeah, the F-35A is capable of taking the B-61 nuclear bomb, which are American bombs, which are stored in Belgium. They're thought to be stored in Belgium. They could be stored in any one of 6 or 7 different bases around the world. And they used to be stored in Britain. They could have been stored at Mildenhall, I think. And they might be again. So the idea of having the F-35A is it's not only nuclear, it's nuclear capable, so you can use it for all sorts of other things. But if you ever wanted to use it for a nuclear device, you could. That's the one you would use.
The B-61 it's a gravity bomb, isn't it?
That's right.
You drop it. It's not a cruise missile.
It's not a missile. It's a bomb. So the aircraft's got to actually fly over the target, which is a pretty dangerous thing to have to do. Nevertheless, in a tactical situation, that's not unreasonable, or it's not impossible to imagine. But the issue is, and it's a good one, is that the Americans would have to give permission for the B-61 bombs to be used. They're their bombs, and that's always been the arrangement. They go into the nuclear planning group of NATO, and the assumption has always been, of course, if it ever got as dire as that, the Americans would allow this to happen, because the situation then would be on the verge of general European war with nuclear weapons, and that's about as dire as you can imagine. But the America that we're looking at for the next 30 or 40 years, maybe not. Maybe they wouldn't automatically give permission.
Yeah.
But in that case, I mean, you're looking then at maybe sharing the devices which the French use, or nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. I mean, there are all sorts of other options. The point about getting the F-35A is that it gives you a capability. I mean, the RAF want the F-35A anyway because it performs better than the B. The B version is the one that we use for carriers, and the compromises of an F-35B operating from a carrier are such that range and weight and all the rest of it. The F-35A is a better aircraft in the air because it doesn't have to operate from a carrier. It doesn't have the sort of the fan thrust and all the things that help it to land and take off vertically. So the F-35A is worth having in any case. If, say, a squadron of 12 of them, if we have, let's say, 50 or 60, if a squadron of 12 of them is nuclear capable, well, it gives you that capability. But there may be some consideration in the future as to whether it should be made capable of something other than the B-61 American bomb because of the political situation that might exist in 10 years' time.
Appreciate the question, Crouch. It's got me thinking as well. You mentioned the Tempest program, which is Britain's next generation.
Sixth generation, yeah.
I've had a quick Google. That's not going to be nuclear capable of carrying a nuclear bomb.
Not due to be.
The internet.
No.
The internet.
Well, because
you can tell me the truth.
Yeah. At the time when Tempest was still in conception, the idea of aircraft-delivered nuclear weapons didn't come up.
You just didn't think that was going to be something.
Think of it. We've only started to think about it in the last year because the changing American commitment to Europe may mean that the Europeans have got to think themselves about tactical nuclear responses, and this one is a reasonably easy way of going down that road. It's not without criticism, though. I mean, I've received a few things from ex-military chiefs saying they think this is a foolish decision.
To really?
To create nuclear-capable aircraft, yeah. You say we're doing it for the glamour of being in the nuclear business at a tactical level. You know, we've got our national nuclear force, our submarine force, for national survival. And lots of other countries do the tactical stuff. There's no reason why we have to do it, just to show we can.
Interesting.
And we ought to be spending the money on other things. So it's not without its critics, this decision.
And just, sorry, final point, because, I get lost on rabbit holes here. There's also the Global Combat Air Program, which we're in with Italy.
That's the one, yeah. That's the Tempest.
Is that
GCAP?
That is part of Tempest.
Yeah. The official name is GCAP, Global Combat Air Program, because nobody wants to call it an aeroplane, because actually the aeroplane is the least important part of it.
Right.
It's the system. So it's a global combat air program, but to you and me, it's a Tempest.
Right.
And you can see a Tempest. It's RF Marham, if it's still there. There's a Tempest in the hangar with the F-35s, and it's all fiberglass. And it's
very useful.
Yeah, it's an aeroplane. It looks like a sort of futuristic aeroplane, and it's something for ministers to be photographed in front
of.
This is what we're going to have. Nobody knows what the Tempest will really look
brilliant.
Like. Because the aeroplane is
there are pictures of it, yeah.
It's the least important part of it. But the picture you see there, it's a picture of a fiberglass model.
Serious question.
It's a big air fix.
But it took ages to put together. Would they?
I'd have loved that as a teenager. All my airfix models, believe me.
Get a huge life-size one that you can actually sit in.
Hang it from the ceiling of your bedroom.
Yeah, rather than end up sitting on and breaking, as I did with my ones. Would there be a drive, though, do you think, to convert this to be able to carry nuclear weapons as
possibly?
As we're going along?
Possibly. The thing is that the requirements, the air requirements for an aircraft that carries a nuclear weapon are not that great. It doesn't have to be the fastest or the highest. What is useful about the F-35 is it's stealthy. So if you're going to have to fly over a target, then being stealthy is the idea. I mean, the Typhoon, is not stealthy enough. And the Tempest should be stealthy, but we don't know yet. I mean, the thing is still in production. But if it was a very stealthy aircraft, then getting it certified and fitted to drop a nuclear bomb would not be that difficult.
Okay, let's move on. Let's be quick fire. Sorry, I got myself lost there on fighter jets chat.
It's your fault.
It's my problem. I'm sorry about that. All right, question here about Iran, Russia and China.
Yep.
From Alex S. Is Russia being an ally of Iran actually a blessing in disguise as it aligns the United States with Ukraine?
They're separate issues in a way, but I know what you mean. I mean, the Russians have shown that they're not prepared to do anything for the Iranians, even though they concluded a security arrangement, a security agreement with them earlier this year. It doesn't mean anything. So when the Iranians need them, the Russians are not there. Or haven't been so far. And I don't think the Russians will go into this because they don't want to upset the United States. So Putin doesn't want to upset Trump. And if he helps the Iranians now, and Trump finds out about it, then that will actually upset his relationship with Washington.
Right.
So I think the Russians are going to stand off from this. It is, I mean, and the Russians have certainly, they lost in Syria with the fall of Assad. They're losing in Iran with the defenestration of Khamenei and his regime. So they are losing influence in this respect, but they're playing it long. And they've got far less influence in the Middle East than they had a few years ago. But nevertheless, they still think of themselves as a player.
Right. A couple more questions on Iran. Could, or perhaps would, actually, the question here from Barry, Russia now provide Iran with emergency facilities to enrich uranium covertly?
They could, but I don't think they will, for the reasons I've just mentioned. I mean, the Bashir nuclear reactor was always the one that the Iranians had, and that was Russia supplied. It was a research reactor, and that was part of the deal, that the Russians said, look, we'll help you with a civil nuclear program, all above board, and the Bashir nuclear reactor, had all the things you need to go nuclear. And that still exists, the Bashir nuclear reactor. So that, yes, they could do it, but I don't think they will, because the risks to their relationship with the United States would be too high.
Yeah. Different.
If Joe Biden,
I was going to say it's different with Trump in the White House, isn't it?
Yeah. If the White House was not the way it is now, I think the Russians would be tempted to do it.
Yeah.
But they now perceive that they've got this historic opportunity to get off the hook with America, because Trump is so easy on them that they don't want to mess it up.
Interesting. Webster asks, does anyone know where all those lorries went, the ones that were apparently carrying... You left Fordo. We don't know what they were carrying, but they were...
Well, yeah, we don't...
Fordo.
I mean, for all we know, they might have been taking stuff into Fordo. I mean, they might have been taking things in to protect them in their underground sites. So we don't know what they would know. So the short answer is we don't know what the lorries were doing there. But in answer to the implied question, could they have moved out their 406... kilograms, or it was 406 according to the IAEA.
Okay, on the
they always say more than 400.
More than 400. Yeah, I've been
406.
saying 400 on the...
I don't know why I remember these figures, but anyway, I do.
You're you. That's why.
And these kilograms, more than 400 kilos of highly enriched uranium to 60%. How much space do they take? Not much. So what you do is you cool it. It's a gas. You cool it to a powder, and then you store it in tanks. And the tanks, some say, look like a domestic boiler. Others have said they look like scuba tanks.
So big. You could...
How many do you need? 16 to 20.
Interesting.
One truckload.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Done. Okay.
And there's your 400 kilos. How many of those kilos do you need to make a device? Depends on the efficiency of the device. But the Hiroshima bomb was about 72 kilos.
Right.
But it was less than 2% efficient when it went off. I mean, but that was enough for Hiroshima.
This is how you get to that 9 to 12 potentially bombs that they could make.
Yeah. So 25 kilos, 30 kilos, if it was, say, 10% efficient, would give you a Hiroshima-sized bomb. Can they do it? If they've got the enriched uranium, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Interesting. All right, question here from Elliot. Has the US involvement against Iran made a Chinese invasion of Taiwan more or less likely?
A little bit less likely. A little bit less. I mean, what Trump has shown is that he's prepared to use military power. And he showed that. I mean, he attacked, there was an attack on Syria in his first term. There's the attack on the Houthis, which people have sort of forgotten about. But I mean, the US ran a sort of a long, month-long campaign against the Houthis. I mean, people's attention was elsewhere, but they run hundreds of attacks on the Houthis. Now this attack on Iran, which is the most public of all, and of course the attack on Soleimani in 2020, the assassination of Soleimani, of the head of the IRGC. So Trump is not frightened to use US military power, but he is frightened to get involved in what looks like a continuing campaign.
Yeah.
And in Taiwan, I mean, the Chinese now realise that Trump, is quite likes using the military. He has that sort of mentality. He likes to use it, but that he'd be reluctant to get involved in what might risk a shooting war. And I think I think they'll feel a bit more deterred, but only a bit. And I mean, 2 weeks ago, the Chinese were running a massive exercise around Taiwan. They had all their 3 carriers, or 2 carrier battle groups out, which they've never done before, and a 3rd carrier on the way. And they even placed a task force in blocking positions against any US involvement. Yeah, they put them way to the east.
Interesting.
So that in an event, they'd have a blocking fleet to stop the US moving more reinforcements into the area. They went through the whole process of attacking Taiwan a couple of weeks ago in exercise form.
Wow. And we kind of skipped over it because there were
we were talking about
things
other
going
things
on
at the time.
I suppose the thing as well that Trump showed with the attack on those nuclear sites in Iran, B-2s flying from the States, as we discussed.
Yeah.
it just shows the might of the US Air Force and its ability.
And do you know, I think that was part of it, Kamali. You know, they say, why did we send half a dozen B-2s to Guam? It was a deception exercise. Well, maybe it was, but I think also it's to show the Chinese, look, we do know what you're doing. We haven't forgotten. And look what we can do. You know, we can bomb the Middle East with these aircraft, but we can also, if we wanted to, we could bomb you from Guam. I think that was also the message to Beijing of sending those B-2s to Guam.
Okay, we're going to go a couple more questions on Iran, and then we're going to finish up because we've been going for a long time, Michael. I do appreciate it, and thank you guys for sticking with us. Question here from PG. Open question. I wonder how you're going to respond to it, Michael. Why didn't Israel and the US finish the job in Iran? I guess what's left out of that is what finish the job means. Is that regime change? I mean, we don't know, but
yeah, what do they mean, regime change? I mean, that's it's not a popular idea, regime change, because when it's been tried in the last 30 years, it goes terribly wrong. But what we may be talking about is not so much regime change as a change of the regime in Iran, so that the regime behaves differently as a result of this attack. And for that, the United States was absolutely involved in changing the behavior of the regime, if not in regime change. I mean, Trump mused about it, and Netanyahu, and the Israelis, Israel Katz, the defense minister, said, it is not our objective, but if it happened, we'd be quite glad.
Yeah.
And of course, that makes it at least 50% of your objective if you think it's a desirable outcome. Why didn't they carry on? Because they were never sure whether it was a good idea to do so. But they are interested in changing the behavior of the regime, whether or not the Khamenei regime remains in power.
Okay, last question, and it's on Khamenei as well. We heard his response. Would you say a hard slap to the face is what the US got? Whether or not that's true, leave that up to you to answer, Michael. He claimed victory, of course. In your opinion, who won the conflict? Can we describe it as being won? And what lessons will other nations take from it? A question there from Inzi.
Yeah, I mean, this conflict, let's say it was a 12-day conflict between Israel and Iran, in which the Americans stepped in at the end and produced this sort of grand finale to this stage of it. Who won it? Undoubtedly, Israel and the United States. Undoubtedly. And so far, it has achieved their objectives. I mean, whether that will still be the case in a month's time or 2 months' time, we don't know. It'll take the Iranians some time to recover from this, because they had at least 30, according to the Israelis. The Israelis said that they assassinated 30 or eliminated 30 key members of the government and of the scientific community. And undoubtedly, it's taken Tehran some time to recover from this, just as a decision-making body. So it's a bit early to say what Iranian reactions are. I think in a month's time or 2 months' time, we'll get a better sense of it. But so far as we are now, then undoubtedly this has been a 90% success for Israel and the United States. There's not much the Iranians are able to do immediately. And
we haven't seen the streets erupt as well to try and overthrow the regime.
No, I mean, and both Netanyahu and Trump now think that as a result of those strikes, they have more political options than they had before. So they've converted their military dominance into political capital, or they think they're about to or can, whilst the Iranians, for all their boasting, have been proved to be an empty vessel. I mean, they weren't able to help their clients in Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis. I mean, they've dabbled, but it's always been a low-risk dabbling. And now, in a sense, their clients have been demolished, or at least severely constrained. They are, in Chinese terms, a paper tiger. And we'll see if they can. It's a big country, 90 million people, with the revolution that they will defend. We'll see what happens in Iran. So Iran's not going to disappear. No. But the Iran that we were accustomed to before the 7th of October, and even the Iran of last year, is no longer, is no more. So what we'll see emerge from this series of disasters that they've had, 7th of October was a disaster for them. It just got worse and worse and worse up to 12 days ago, or this 12-day campaign. We'll see what comes out of it from there. And I wouldn't like to be making decisions in Tehran at the moment.
Yeah, very difficult for them. All right, we'll leave it there, Michael, for this week. Thank you very much for that. Thank you guys for being with us. We will do another one of these again very soon. Past couple of weeks have been busy, so we've been off, but I know you've been on, Michael, doing other Q&As on other topics. But thank you very much, as always, for submitting your questions, and I promise we'll see you again very soon.